Harry flew out of the UK completely unbothered this week. No paparazzi chasing him through an airport. No security incident of any kind. Absolutely no drama attached to the actual journey itself, which is exactly the problem.
Breaking today, Meghan Markle breaks her agreement with King Charles and Buckingham Palace to leak to her friends at People magazine less than a week after that promised meeting with Charles and Queen Camilla. Meanwhile, Prince Harry has arrived back in the United States completely fine, proving the point that I have made, by the way, for months and years, that they can travel in and out of the UK with their children privately with absolutely no issues whatsoever.
If you've been paying attention to what he's been arguing for years, because it turns out the man who says he can't safely bring his family to Britain apparently has no trouble at all moving through it alone, cameras or no cameras. Let's start with that specific detail, because I genuinely think it sets up everything else that unfolded across this particular week better than any other single fact could. Harry showed up at the Time 100 event practically glowing, working the photographers like a man who'd forgotten he spends most interviews describing camera flashes as something close to trauma. One commentator, Toure Bukhari, put it about as sharply as anyone has. A man who's poured millions into failed privacy lawsuits, who says flashbulbs terrify him, doing cheesy have you got my best side turns for photographers like it's the most natural thing in the world, hypocritical old ham, in his exact words. And the footage backs it up. Harry thanking photographers individually, telling one he's the most polite man he's ever met, playing along with a bit about being sad England lost a match, all warmth and charm for the cameras he supposedly dreads.
Prince Harry has in the past directly emailed People magazine. We know that People magazine effectively operates as like the house journal for the Sussexes. And we know that Meghan Markle wanted it to be known to the world that the choreography of this meeting was nothing to do with her.
Meghan wasn't anywhere near the event, and I genuinely think that specific absence is worth pausing on for a moment before we move forward into everything else. Because a woman whose entire public identity depends on being seen chose not to be seen standing next to her husband at an event he clearly wanted to enjoy during the exact week his biggest court case collapsed. When the chips are down, in other words, she apparently didn't want the photo. Now here's where the whole picture gets considerably messier and genuinely more interesting. Less than a week after Harry and Meghan reportedly agreed with the palace that nobody would brief the press to shape the narrative around this visit, People magazine ran an exclusive cover story anyway, sourced by every reasonable reading, straight from the Sussex camp. And the headline told you everything about the strategy. Meghan always lets Harry lead when it comes to the royal family. Translation: whatever chaos unfolded that week, don't blame her. One quote in the piece claimed there'd been an about-face, that security concerns had suddenly prevented a full family visit, except nothing had actually changed.
That she would have felt humiliated, oh poor Meghan, humiliated watching the public back and forth unfold. Another source tells People Meghan is very supportive of Harry, adding there's a lot of sadness over how the week unfolded and that she wasn't able to be by his side.
The security situation was exactly what it had already been agreed to be. No about-face, just a version of events dressed up to sound like new information. There's a broader pattern worth naming here before we go further, because it connects directly to the Time 100 footage. Harry's public complaint about media intrusion has always rested on a specific claim, that camera flashes, crowds, and constant attention are genuinely distressing to him, tied directly to what he witnessed happen to his mother. That's not a claim I think should be dismissed lightly. There's real, documented trauma underneath it. But the footage from this specific event shows a man who is not merely tolerating cameras. He's actively performing for them, engaging warmly, seeking out individual photographers to thank personally. That's not someone managing anxiety. That's someone who understands exactly how to use a camera when the camera is working in his favor rather than against his preferred narrative.
Well, I think that'll probably be a big issue for him because they do love a controversy because it boosts their brand, it boosts their numbers. But the reality is, you summed it up brilliantly in that intro, but you know, this has been a fiasco, it's been a circus.
The inconsistency isn't necessarily proof of dishonesty about the underlying trauma. But it does suggest the relationship with media attention is considerably more selective and more strategic than the public framing usually allows for. Stay with me, because this is where a royal commentator's analysis genuinely reframed how I understood the entire week, and I think it's worth walking through in careful detail. The core argument goes like this. Harry knew roughly when the court verdict was coming, and probably had a decent sense of which way it would go before almost anyone else did. And in that context, showing up at Buckingham Palace itself, the actual headquarters of the monarchy, right as he was publicly attacking the judiciary, the press, and by extension the government, would have created something close to a genuine constitutional problem.
I thought that this whole nonsense about the security was something they've just dreamed up from their own team. If you speak to people in the intelligence services, there is no threat against Harry, and that is why Ravak have not stepped up the security. If there was, the security level would be higher, and he would get an appropriate security as long as he gave them the notice that was required to actually do that review.
A free press, an independent judiciary, an elected government. Those are the three pillars the king is constitutionally there to protect, not undermine. Harry railing against a judge as a whitewash from inside Buckingham Palace itself would have been an optics disaster verging on a real institutional crisis, which makes the palace's decision to quietly withdraw that accommodation offer at the last moment look less like a snub and more like a save. Someone inside that building recognized the risk and pulled the plug just in time. It's worth sitting with the sheer weight of that specific argument for a moment because it's easy to skip past. A constitutional monarchy survives, structurally, on the principle that the monarch and everyone around the monarch remains above active political and institutional conflict, that the crown does not take sides in disputes involving the judiciary, the elected government, or the free press, because doing so undermines the entire premise of what makes the monarchy legitimate in a modern democracy.
Well, it's not about his safety in the UK. I know this because I know people, Jobbo, who have this Ravik protection. And you know, once you get it, you have to be protected wherever in the world you are. So what it means is that the UK taxpayer would be effectively funding Harry's security while in California, but also, Jobbo, if he decided to go to Ukraine again, if he goes to Nigeria, if he goes to Colombia. So all of a sudden what would happen is Harry would be able to wipe that $3 million security bill altogether.
Harry attacking a high court judge as delivering a whitewash while simultaneously being hosted at the actual physical headquarters of that same monarchy would have created exactly the kind of entanglement the institution has spent centuries carefully avoiding. Whoever made the call to withdraw that accommodation offer at the last possible moment may well have prevented something considerably larger than an awkward headline. There's a competing account worth putting directly against the palace victim narrative Meghan's team was apparently trying to sell through that People magazine piece. Royal commentator Tom Sykes made the point plainly. It was Harry's own team that fired the starting pistol on turning this into a public spectacle in the first place.
Okay, I remember writing it at the time. Before you broke that story of the split, there was discussions going on. And then the reality is, that the one thing that the king, who was then Prince of Wales, told his son was, have you thought about it? Have you given it all the thought? Because security, is a big issue. You will not get it, definitely, if you're out of the royal family. You then broke the story in The Sun, and then Harry just assumed he was going to get it.
Issuing an unprompted operational note to journalists confirming the whole family was flying over for what Sykes described as a thrillingly billed dramatic rapprochement. Harry knew full well the security situation hadn't changed, that Ravik hadn't magically upgraded his protection, and made travel arrangements anyway. Arrangements he then very publicly canceled days later, citing the exact security situation he already knew about when he made the plans. The palace, by this reading, said essentially nothing throughout. They just waited, patiently, for the Sussexes to make up their minds about a hospitality offer that had already been sitting on the table for months before any of this became public. This is why the about-face language in the People piece is worth flagging specifically as misleading rather than simply spun. An about-face implies something genuinely changed, new information, a shifted position, a reversal of an earlier commitment. What actually happened, according to multiple accounts including Tom Sykes's, is that the security terms were exactly what they'd already been for years. and Harry's team made travel plans anyway, fully aware of those terms before publicly walking them back days later. Calling that an about-face on security is a bit like announcing a sudden weather change when you've simply decided to check the forecast you already had sitting in front of you the entire time. If this breakdown is useful, the like button helps this channel keep reaching people who want the fuller picture rather than the version dressed up for a magazine cover. Stay with me because the meeting itself has a detail in it that genuinely changes how you read everything that followed. Camilla being present throughout the actual Highgrove meeting matters more than it might initially seem. She was, after all, someone Harry attacked fairly directly in his memoir, and the read from at least one seasoned royal commentator is that her presence wasn't really about warmth. It was about keeping Charles from making promises he shouldn't make, essentially functioning as a guardian in the room to keep the conversation contained specifically to the grandchildren, where family rifts are always easiest to talk around without actually addressing what caused the rift in the first place. In roughly 5 years, this amounts to 2 solo meetings between Harry and his father, and now 1 occasion where the children were actually present. That's the entire scorecard of reconciliation so far. Think about what that Camilla detail actually implies for a moment, because it reframes the entire meeting from something spontaneous into something considerably more managed. If the goal was genuinely just father and son time, her presence wasn't strictly necessary. Charles could have simply met his son alone the way he apparently has on other occasions. Her presence specifically at this meeting, the one involving the grandchildren, suggests a deliberate choice to keep the conversation contained to safe, uncontroversial territory with someone in the room whose entire relationship history with Harry gives her every incentive to keep things that way. That's not necessarily cynical on Charles's part. It might simply be prudent given everything that's happened over the past several years. But it does mean the warm family reunion being sold publicly and the actual managed diplomatic encounter that reportedly took place are not quite the same thing. And here's the theory that I think deserves real attention, even though it's genuinely uncomfortable to sit with, that a meaningful part of what's actually driving Harry's continued push for reconciliation isn't really about repairing the relationship purely for its own sake. It's about money. Charles is living with cancer, on borrowed time in a way none of us can fully calculate. And once William becomes king, there will reportedly be no further financial support flowing Harry's way. The only significant payday left, in this reading, is whatever comes to him when his father eventually passes. Harry wanting his children to know their grandfather is almost certainly genuine on some level, but the timing, the urgency, the willingness to submit to Charles's terms after years of standoff, all of that reportedly tracks a lot more cleanly with financial calculation than with pure sentiment. Harry wanting his children to genuinely know their grandfather is almost certainly real on some emotional level. Very few people would argue a father shouldn't want that for his own kids, especially with time genuinely uncertain. But the specific timing of this reconciliation push, the willingness to finally accept Charles's terms after years of standoff, the urgency that seemed to appear almost overnight, none of that maps particularly well onto pure sentiment alone. It maps considerably more cleanly onto a financial calculation that anyone in Harry's position would eventually have to confront. Once William becomes king, the personal, discretionary financial support Charles has reportedly been providing simply stops. What remains after that point is almost entirely tied to inheritance, and inheritance only becomes accessible once the person providing it has actually passed away. Which brings us to the specific number that should actually worry anyone watching the Sussex finances closely right now. The legal costs from the Daily Mail case, reportedly in the region of £30 million or more, with the Mail's team now going back to court specifically to recover it. Elton John has reportedly made it clear he's not covering Harry's share of that bill. Add to that roughly £3 million a year in private security costs, and you start to understand why security has become such an obsessive focus for Harry specifically, and why the explanation might have less to do with actual physical safety than most coverage assumes. This is also where the pattern of consistent, borderline obsessive focus on security actually starts making a different kind of sense than the safety narrative provides on its own. £3 million is a genuinely enormous annual burden for a household whose commercial income has reportedly been contracting rather than growing. If there were a legitimate path to eliminating that entire cost line permanently, pursuing it aggressively would be the obviously rational move for anyone managing a household budget under that kind of pressure, regardless of how much genuine safety concern also happens to exist alongside it. Here's the specific detail that genuinely reframes the entire security dispute once you actually understand how Ravec protection functions in practice. It isn't a UK-specific arrangement. Once you're covered wherever you go. Which means if Harry ever got that reinstated, UK taxpayers would effectively be funding his private security in California, in Nigeria, in Colombia, in Ukraine, anywhere he travels globally, not just inside Britain. That's not a theory. It's simply how the existing system works for everyone who has it, former prime ministers included. Tony Blair's security, wherever he happens to be in the world, comes out of the same taxpayer-funded structure. If Harry secured that same status, his entire £3 million annual private security bill would essentially disappear, replaced by public funding covering him everywhere on Earth. That reframes the security fight from a safety question into a fairly straightforward financial one. That reframes the entire multi-year security fight in a way most coverage never quite lands on. This has been presented for years as a story about a father protecting his children from genuine danger, and that framing may well contain real truth. But it is also, simultaneously, a story about a fairly specific and quantifiable financial outcome, eliminating a multi-million-pound annual expense by transferring it permanently onto UK taxpayers, wherever in the world Harry happens to be standing on any given day. Both things can be true at once. The genuine desire for safety and the very real financial incentive are not mutually exclusive, and pretending the fight is purely about one or purely about the other misses what's actually happening. And there's real history here that keeps getting quietly rewritten every time this story gets retold. Before the actual split happened, Charles reportedly warned his son directly, asked him whether he genuinely thought through what stepping back would mean, specifically flagging that security wasn't guaranteed once he was outside the working royal structure. Harry apparently assumed his military service, including time in Afghanistan, would be enough to secure it regardless. It wasn't, and that miscalculation, according to people who covered the story as it broke, was a significant error in how the whole exit was planned. Charles reportedly funded Harry's security privately for a full year afterward, something in the region of £5 million, specifically to give the couple time to sort out their plans. Eventually, the calls apparently kept coming, and Charles reportedly said plainly, "I am not a bank," which, whatever else you think about how this family handles conflict, is a fairly reasonable position for a father to land on after a year of covering costs voluntarily. Which is a genuinely reasonable position for a father to eventually land on, whatever else you think about how this family manages conflict internally, because there has to be a point where ongoing generosity stops functioning as support and starts functioning as an open-ended obligation with no natural endpoint. Now here's the part of this week that I think genuinely deserves the most scrutiny out of everything we've covered so far, because the specific timing here really doesn't look like coincidence once you lay it out plainly. On the same day, both People magazine and the New York Times ran pieces specifically framing the ongoing Harry-William rift as something sitting mostly on William's shoulders. People quoted a source saying it's so broken that there'd been no real movement, especially on William's side. The Times ran with missing from Harry's UK trip, a reunion with his brother, framing Harry's relationship with Charles as being actively repaired while the rift with William sits unresolved, seemingly through no fault of Harry's own. Worth noting how each side responded to media inquiries, because the difference is instructive. Harry's team declined to comment, meaning they engaged, just chose not to go on record. Kensington Palace, representing William, simply didn't respond at all, meaning they ignored the request entirely. No engagement whatsoever. That distinction matters. A decline to comment still involves contact. A non-response involves none, which suggests that whatever shaped these stories, it likely came from one side rather than both, dressed up to look neutral. There's a specific reason that distinction between decline to comment and non-response matters more than it might initially seem. When an outlet says a spokesperson declined to comment, it confirms that outlet made direct contact and the other side chose deliberately not to engage on the record, which still leaves open the possibility they engage considerably more freely off the record, shaping the story's framing without their fingerprints showing up in the final quote. A non-response, by contrast, suggests no engagement happened at all in either direction. Applied here, it suggests one side of this sibling rift was actively involved in shaping how these particular stories got told, while the other side genuinely wasn't consulted or simply chose complete silence rather than any level of engagement. The New York Times running a royal story at all is itself genuinely notable. It's not a publication that covers this beat often, and when it does, there's typically a specific reason behind the choice. Both pieces landing the same day, both broadly sympathetic to the Sussex position, is the kind of pattern that's very hard to read as pure coincidence once you actually look at it directly. So where does all of this actually leave things? Harry proved by simply existing in public for a week without incident that he can move through Britain safely. The People magazine leak, whatever the palace agreement supposedly said, happened anyway. Because, as more than one commentator put it, leaking is simply what this operation does. It was always only a matter of time. Camilla's presence at Highgrove wasn't really about warmth so much as containment. The reconciliation with Charles, genuine as parts of it may be, sits inside a financial context that's considerably harder to ignore than most coverage lets on. And the William framing running through two major outlets on the same day looks a lot more like coordinated messaging than spontaneous journalism. So where does all of this actually leave you as an observer trying to make sense of a genuinely complicated week? Harry demonstrated, simply by existing safely in public for several days, that the core safety argument has real holes in it regardless of how sincerely it's held. The People magazine leak happened despite an apparent agreement not to leak because, as more than one commentator put it plainly, this operation leaks consistently. It was only ever a matter of when rather than if. Camilla's presence at Highgrove looks considerably more like careful containment than simple warmth once you examine it closely. The reconciliation itself, genuine as parts of it may well be, sits inside a financial context that's considerably harder to responsibly ignore than most of the sentimental coverage allows for. And the coordinated-looking William framing running through two major outlets on the exact same day reads a lot more like managed messaging than spontaneous, independent journalism arriving at the same conclusion by coincidence. None of this erases what's genuinely human sitting underneath the whole story. A grandfather managing a serious illness wanting time with grandchildren he barely knows. Children who did nothing to deserve being used as leverage in a decades-long family dispute. But wanting the sentimental version to be the whole story doesn't make it the whole story. The money is real. The security calculation is real. The pattern of leaking, denying, and reframing is real and well documented at this point. What do you genuinely think? Does the inheritance theory actually hold up as a real, meaningful driver behind all of this? Or is that reading considerably too cynical into what might simply be a father and son trying, imperfectly and under difficult circumstances, to fix something that's been broken for years? And separately, do you buy the coordinated messaging read on the People and Times pieces landing the same day? Or does that feel like reaching for a pattern that isn't actually there? Drop your honest take in the comments, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.